My ex-husband pointed at me in court. This dried-up hag contributed nothing to our success. He wanted the fortune I'd built during our marriage. The judge, conveniently his old friend, was already nodding. His lawyer smiled, certain of victory. Then I spoke 5. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. The courtroom that morning felt more like a theater than a place of justice, and I was apparently cast as the fool. Charles sat there in his $1,000 suit, looking every inch the successful businessman. At 58, he still had that charming smile that had first caught my attention 30 years ago, though now it felt as sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," Lucy Doyle was saying, shuffling through her papers with theatrical precision. "Mr. Williams built his business empire." Mrs. Williams, while a devoted wife, was simply a homemaker who enjoyed the fruits of her husband's labor. I almost laughed. Almost. If only she knew that while Charles was out playing golf with clients, I was the one actually running Williams Industries from our home. But I'd played the perfect wife for so long, even I sometimes forgot who I really was underneath all that carefully crafted domesticity. Charles leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from every pore. "Judge Blackwell, you know me. You've known me for 20 years. But the truth is, she spent our marriage shopping and lunching while I worked 18-hour days." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly. Charles had never worked an 18-hour day in his life. Most days, he barely managed 4 productive hours before wandering off. But everyone in that courtroom saw what they expected to see: a powerful man and his grateful wife. "Furthermore," Charles continued, his voice taking on that wounded tone he'd perfected over the years, "Margaret has been completely dependent on me financially. She has no understanding of how wealth is created. I'm willing to be generous with alimony, of course, but the business assets should remain with the person who actually built them." Judge Blackwell nodded sagely, as if Charles had just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Members of the same country club, partners in more than one shady deal over the years. I'd been counting on their arrogance, their absolute certainty that I was just another discarded wife who'd take whatever scraps they threw me. My lawyer, a competent but uninspired man named Robert. "Your Honor, Mrs. Williams supported her husband's career for 30 years. She entertained clients, managed their home, and sacrificed her own ambitions for his success. She deserves equitable distribution of marital assets." It was a perfectly reasonable. But this wasn't a normal case, and Judge Blackwell wasn't interested in being fair. His mind was already made up before we'd even walked into the courtroom. "Mr. Chen," the judge said with barely concealed impatience, "supporting a spouse's career doesn't create. Williams will receive appropriate alimony, but Williams Industries remains the sole property of the man who built it." That's when I stood up. Robert tried to pull me back down, whispering urgent warnings about courtroom protocol. But I'd waited 30 years for this moment. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtroom, "before you make your final ruling, I have something to say." Charles rolled his eyes. "Margaret, please. You're embarrassing yourself." "I am Williams Industries, Charles." The silence that followed. Judge Blackwell's gavel froze halfway to his desk. Lucy Doyle's papers scattered to the floor. And Charles, my dear husband who'd spent 3 decades taking credit for my work, looked like someone had just told him the sun was actually purple. But the real show was just beginning. Because those 5 words weren't just a claim, they were a declaration of war from someone who'd spent years. And Charles was about to learn that underestimating Margaret Williams had been the biggest mistake of his considerably mistake-filled life. You might wonder how a woman ends up in a courtroom being called a dried-up hag by the man who once promised to love her forever. Well, because the truth is always more interesting than the story everyone thinks they know. 31 years ago, I was Margaret Sullivan, fresh out of business school with an MBA from Northwestern and dreams bigger than the small Michigan town where I'd grown up. I had a job offer from a prestigious Chicago consulting firm and a 10-year plan. I was focused, driven, and absolutely certain I didn't need a man to build the life I wanted. Then I met Charles Williams at a coffee shop near campus, and my carefully laid plans went out the window faster than common sense during a clearance sale. With dark hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, and blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, More importantly, he was charming in a way that made you feel like the most fascinating person in the room. Everything else faded to background noise. "You're going to think this is the worst pickup line ever," he said, sliding into the chair across from me without invitation. "But aren't you in Professor Martinez's strategic planning class?" I was, actually, though I'd never noticed him there, which I'd later learn was just one of his many useful talents. "Maybe," I said, not looking up from my business law textbook. I'd learned early that beautiful men usually meant trouble, and I had exactly 0 time for trouble in my schedule. "I'm Charles Williams, and you're the woman who demolished Jenkins's market analysis presentation last week with about 3 sentences of pure..." Professor Jenkins was notorious for accepting weak work from students whose parents made significant donations to the university. The fact that Charles had noticed my criticism meant he was actually paying attention to the academic content, not just coast through on charm. Finally, looking up at him. Anyone with basic understanding of consumer behavior could see he'd completely misread the data. "Exactly." Charles leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "I've been saying for weeks that but no one else seems to care about actual accuracy." We talked for 3 hours that day. Not the usual campus small talk about parties and weekend plans, but real conversation about business theory, market trends, and our plans for the future. Charles told me about how his father had built it from nothing but was losing ground to overseas competition. He spoke passionately about wanting to modernize the business, to find new markets and innovative approaches that would save the jobs of people he'd known since childhood. The kind of complex problem that my strategic planning professors insisted didn't exist in the real world. Here was someone who needed the skills I'd been developing, who valued the analytical thinking that my classmates found intimidating. By the time winter turned, Charles would pick me up after classes, take me to dinner at little restaurants where we'd spread business plans across the table between our plates. He was full of ideas, big dreams about expanding Williams Manufacturing beyond its traditional markets, refining his concepts, helping him think through the financial implications of his ambitious plans. "You're incredible," he told me one evening as I sketched out a distribution strategy on a napkin. "The way your mind works, it's like watching someone solve puzzles that no one else can even see." He admired my mind, but he never suggested I should use it for my own benefit. Even then, Charles was already positioning me as his secret weapon rather than his equal partner. When he proposed 6 months later, it felt like the natural next step in what we'd... "Margaret," he said, down on one knee in the same coffee shop where we'd first met, "let's build something amazing together." I said yes, of course. I was 23 years old and absolutely certain that love and business acumen were all we needed to conquer the world. The consulting job in Chicago suddenly seemed small and unimportant. The wedding was small, just our immediate families in the backyard of my parents' house in Michigan. Charles's father looked skeptical when he shook my hand, as if he wasn't quite sure what his son was doing marrying a woman with opinions about quarterly projections. My mother, bless her heart, because surely that was the point of all this matrimonial excitement. Neither of them understood that we weren't just joining our lives together. We were forming a business partnership that would change everything, or at least, that's what I thought we were doing. The first sign of trouble should have been Charles's reaction when I suggested we both... "Let's keep things simple for now," he said, kissing my forehead like I was a child who'd asked a cute but irrelevant question. "We can always adjust the paperwork later once we see how things develop." Later never came, of course. But by then, I was so deep into building our empire that official ownership... After all, what did it matter whose name was on the documents when I was the one making the decisions that would shape our future? I was about to learn that it mattered more than I could possibly imagine. The first 5 years of our marriage were the most While our friends were settling into comfortable routines of dinner parties and weekend trips, Charles and I were rebuilding Williams Manufacturing from the ground up, though only one of us was getting credit for the transformation. Charles's father, William Sr., same clients, same products, same approaches that had worked when American manufacturing dominated global markets. By the time Charles inherited control, Williams Manufacturing was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured balloon loses air. "We need to completely restructure," I told Charles during one of our late... The books were spread across every available surface, and the numbers told a story that would make a horror novelist proud. Traditional manufacturing is dying. We need to pivot to specialized components for emerging technologies. Charles nodded enthusiastically, as if the ideas were coming from him rather than me. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that seems insignificant until you realize it's part of a larger pattern. Computer technology, I continued, pointing to market research I'd been conducting for months. But someone needs to supply the small components that make their innovations possible. We could be that someone. What followed was 18 months of the most intense work I'd ever done, while Charles handled the social aspects of business, entertaining potential, representing our company at industry events. I redesigned our entire operation from the inside out. I spent weeks at the factory, learning every aspect of our production capabilities. I analyzed our equipment, our workforce, our supply chains, looking for the workers, men who'd known Charles since he was a boy, were initially skeptical of the young woman, asking detailed questions about their machinery. "Mrs. Williams," said Joe Kowalski, our floor supervisor, "you sure you want to be crawling around these machines?" Accepting the coveralls he offered. "If I'm going to redesign this operation, I need to understand exactly what we're working with. And please, call me Margaret." By the end of that first month, the workers had stopped treating me like Charles's curious wife and started treating me like... When I suggested modifications to increase precision in our cutting operations, they listened. When I proposed a new quality control system that would meet the exacting standards of technology companies, they helped me implement it. The real breakthrough came when I contacted Computic Industries, a fast-growing company in California that their vice president of operations, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Chen, agreed to visit our facility based on a detailed proposal I'd sent, outlining our capabilities. "Mrs. Williams," Sandra said after touring our newly configured production floor, "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting, but what you've shown me here is exactly what we've been looking for." The contract she offered was larger than anything Williams Manufacturing had ever handled. It would require us to meet strict quality standards, deliver precise components on aggressive timelines, and maintain It was also exactly the kind of challenge that would establish us as serious players in the emerging technology market. "Can you handle this volume?" Sandra asked, reviewing the specifications with me in the office Charles had set up for my consulting work. "Absolutely," I said, though privately I knew it would require working 16-hour days for the next 6 months. "Williams Manufacturing specializes in the impossible." Sandra laughed. "I like your confidence. Let's do this." When Charles returned from his business trip to Detroit, I presented him with a signed contract worth more than our company's total revenue for the previous year. His reaction was, "Margaret, this is incredible!" He swept me into a hug that lifted me off my feet. "You've just saved our company. We need to celebrate. Call everyone. Let them know Williams Manufacturing is back in business." Notice the phrasing. Our company had suddenly become Williams Manufacturing, and my achievement had become something that needed to be shared with everyone. But I was too excited by our success to pay attention to those subtle shifts in language. The celebration dinner Charles organized included his father, our banker, and several local business leaders. I expected to be introduced as the person who'd secured our "Gentlemen," he said, raising his glass of wine, "I'm pleased to announce that Williams Manufacturing has just signed the largest contract in our company's history. It's taken months of negotiation and careful planning, but we've successfully positioned ourselves as a key supplier to the computer industry." Asking questions about his strategy and vision for the company's future, I sat there smiling politely, waiting for him to mention my role in the achievement we were supposedly celebrating together. "Charles," said our banker, "I have to ask, how did you identify this opportunity? Most traditional manufacturers are struggling." "Robert," Charles replied with a modest smile, "it's all about recognizing trends before they become obvious to everyone else. I've been studying the technology sector for months, looking for ways to leverage our existing capabilities in new markets." He'd been studying the technology, his months of work. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized what was happening. Charles wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was rewriting history to erase my contribution entirely. In his version of events, I was simply the supportive wife. "Margaret," said William Sr., turning to me with a patronizing smile. "You must be so proud of Charles. Not every woman gets to watch her husband save the family business." "Oh, I'm very proud," I replied, my voice sweet as honey with just a hint of something sharper underneath. I never could have imagined how he'd turn my little suggestions into such a comprehensive strategy. Charles shot me a warning look, but the other men just chuckled at what they assumed was wifely modesty. They had no idea that I'd just fired the first shot. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Charles wanted to take credit for my work, fine. But from now on, I'd make sure I had proof of exactly who was responsible for the success of Williams Industries. Every idea, every strategy, because someday I was going to need evidence of what I'd really built. And on that day, Charles Williams was going to discover that underestimating your wife is the most expensive mistake a man can make. 26 years is a long time to maintain a fiction. By the time Charles filed for divorce, Williams Industries had grown from a struggling family business into a multi-million-dollar empire, with manufacturing facilities in 6 states and contracts with major technology companies across 3 continents. Charles had spent those years the brilliant businessman who'd revolutionized American manufacturing. He gave interviews to business magazines, spoke at industry conferences, and collected awards for innovation and leadership. He was very good at being the face of our success. What he did, I'd been documenting everything. Every late-night strategy session where I'd outlined expansion plans. Every market analysis I'd conducted that led to new contracts. Every innovative solution I'd developed for production challenges. Every relationship I'd built with clients who thought they were dealing with Charles's mysterious consultant, but were actually working directly. I kept it all in a safety deposit box across town, along with recorded conversations, email backups, and financial documents that told the real story of who'd built our empire. Charles thought my daily trips to run errands were just typical housewife activities. He had no idea I was actually maintaining the most comprehensive business. But my secret documentation project was nothing compared to the real ace up my sleeve. I knew about Charles and Judge Blackwell's little side business. It started innocently enough, the way most corruption does. 3 years into our marriage, Charles mentioned that his old law school friend, Harrison Blackwell, was running for circuit court. He's a good guy, Margaret, the kind of judge who understands how business really works. I wrote the check without thinking much about it. Harrison was charming in the same way Charles was, and he seemed genuinely interested in supporting local business development. When he won the election, we celebrated with. The first favor was small. Harrison expedited a zoning variance that allowed us to expand our original facility. Nothing illegal, just a judge using his influence to move paperwork through the system faster than usual. Charles was grateful, and Harrison was happy to help an old friend succeed. But success has. And soon Charles and Harrison were finding increasingly creative ways to help each other. Harrison would tip Charles off about companies facing legal troubles, and Charles would swoop in with offers to acquire their assets at bargain prices. Charles would provide Harrison, and Harrison would make sure his real estate investments were positioned to benefit from upcoming projects. They thought they were being clever, meeting at the country club, using coded language in their conversations, keeping their transactions just barely within legal boundaries. What they didn't including the financial details they assumed were too boring for me to understand. By the time Charles decided he wanted a divorce to marry his latest mistress, a dental hygienist named Tracy, who was young enough to be our daughter, I had enough evidence to destroy not. The irony was perfect. Charles wanted to leave me for a younger woman, and he assumed his friendship with Judge Blackwell would ensure he kept control of Williams Industries in the divorce settlement. He had no idea that his corrupt relationship with Harrison. Margaret, Charles had said 6 months earlier, when he first broached the subject of divorce, I think we both know this marriage has run its course. We've grown apart, become different people. I think it's time we moved on with our lives. Such civilized language for such a betrayal. We hadn't grown apart. He'd simply decided he preferred, and he certainly hadn't become a different person. Charles was exactly the same charming, ambitious, fundamentally dishonest man I'd married 30 years earlier. I was the one who'd changed, who'd grown tired of pretending his success was anything more than elaborate theft of my achievements. I suppose you have some thoughts about keeping my voice carefully neutral. Well, naturally, Williams Industries would stay with me. You've never been involved in the actual business operations, and I'd hate for you to be burdened with responsibilities you're not equipped to handle. Not equipped to handle. The business I'd built from nothing, brick by brick, innovation by innovation, was apparently too complex for my delicate feminine brain to comprehend. Of course, I'd said. That makes sense. I wouldn't want to interfere with your work. Charles had looked relieved that I was being so reasonable about his plans to steal everything I'd created. He probably thought 30 years of marriage had beaten any fight out of me, that I'd learned to accept whatever scraps he chose to throw my way. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. The morning of our divorce hearing, I sat in the courtroom watching Charles and his lawyer, Lucy Doyle, arrange their papers with confident efficiency. They had character witnesses ready to testify about Charles's business acumen, financial experts prepared to explain why I deserved nothing more than basic alimony, and Judge Blackwell's obvious bias ensuring their victory. They thought they held all the cards. They had no idea I'd been playing a completely different game for 26 years, and that checkmate was already 3 moves away. When I stood up in that courtroom and said those 5 words, "I am Williams Industries, Charles," I wasn't just making a dramatic statement. I was serving notice that the real game was about to begin, because hidden in my purse was a flash drive containing 26 years of evidence. Documentation proving that every major business decision Charles had claimed credit for was actually my work. Financial records showing how he and Judge Blackwell had used their positions to manipulate contracts and acquisitions for personal gain. Recorded conversations that would make both men the subject of federal investigations. Charles had wanted a divorce. What he was about to get was a masterclass in what happens when you underestimate the woman who actually built your empire. The look on his face when I spoke those 5 words was just the beginning. Before this day was over, Charles Williams was going to learn that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone thinks is powerless. And Judge Blackwell was about to discover that 30 years of corruption had finally caught up with him, delivered by the quiet housewife he'd dismissed as irrelevant to the proceedings. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a wire about to snap. Judge Blackwell's face had gone from its usual confident pink to an alarming shade of gray, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out what I meant by those 5 simple words. Charles recovered first, which was typical. He'd always been quick on his feet when his reputation was threatened. "Your Honor," he said with a laugh that sounded just a little too forced. "My wife is obviously upset about the divorce proceedings. She's not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 30 years, I replied, reaching into my purse. "And I have documentation to prove every word I just said." Lucy Doyle half rose from her chair. "Your Honor, if Mrs. Williams has evidence she wishes to present, it should have been submitted during discovery." "Oh, I don't think discovery quite covers what I'm about to share," I said, pulling out the flash drive I'd been carrying for 6 months, waiting for exactly this moment. "Unless you typically ask divorcing parties to document federal crimes during standard proceedings." The word federal hit the courtroom like a physical force. Judge Blackwell's gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Charles went very still, the kind of stillness that comes when someone realizes they've walked into a trap they never saw coming. "Federal crimes?" Robert Chen, my own lawyer, whispered urgently. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" I'd kept this from Robert deliberately. He was a good man, competent and honest, which meant he'd have tried to talk me out of my plan if he'd known what I was really carrying in my purse. Sometimes justice requires a little theater, and Robert would have insisted on proper procedure over dramatic revelation. "Your Honor," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom, "before you award Williams Industries to my husband, I think you should know that I've spent 26 years documenting his business practices. And yours." Judge Blackwell shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. "Mrs. Williams, I don't know what you think you're implying, but this court will not tolerate the Riverside Development Project," I said calmly. "Charles acquired that land for $2 million after you provided him with advance notice of the highway expansion plans. He sold it to the state for $8 million 6 months later. Your real estate trust purchased the adjacent properties 2 weeks before the public announcement." The courtroom erupted. Lucy Doyle was frantically whispering to Charles, who looked like someone had just told him his house was on fire. Judge Blackwell was demanding order, but his voice had lost all authority. "The Morrison Industries acquisition," I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Charles bought their assets for 30 cents on the dollar after you expedited the lawsuit that forced them into bankruptcy. A lawsuit based on environmental violations that mysteriously appeared in their file just days before your ruling. These are serious accusations," Judge Blackwell said, trying to regain control of his courtroom. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, it should be presented to the proper authorities." "Oh, I have?" I said with a smile that felt like ice on my lips. "Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Sandra Martinez is in the hallway right now, waiting for my signal to join these proceedings. Should I invite her in?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Charles was staring at me like I'd just sprouted wings and declared myself the Queen of England. Judge Blackwell looked like he was considering whether jumping out the window would be less painful than whatever was about to happen next. "Margaret," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what have you done?" "I've done exactly what you taught me to do," I replied. "I've been planning for the future, anticipating problems, and documenting everything. The only difference is that I was planning for this day instead of the next quarterly report." Lucy Doyle cleared her throat, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her case. "Your Honor, even if Mrs. Williams has evidence of irregularities in business dealings, that doesn't change the fundamental question of asset division in this divorce." "Actually, it changes everything," I said, turning to face her directly. "Because Williams Industries was built using illegally obtained information, fraudulent contracts, and corrupt judicial decisions, which means the entire business is the product of criminal enterprise. And under federal law, the proceeds of criminal enterprise are subject to forfeiture." The realization hit Charles like a physical blow. He actually swayed in his chair, gripping the table for support. "You can't. The business is legitimate. We employ hundreds of people. The business is legitimate now," I agreed. "But its foundation was built on crimes you and Judge Blackwell committed together. Every major contract we secured, every expansion we made, every success Charles claimed credit for, it was all possible because of insider information and judicial corruption." I walked to the front of the courtroom, holding the flash drive like a weapon. "This contains 26 years of evidence, phone recordings, email correspondence, financial documents, and meeting notes. Everything needed to prove that Williams Industries was built through a conspiracy between my husband and this court." Judge Blackwell made one last desperate attempt to maintain his authority. "Mrs. Williams, I'm ordering you to surrender that device to the court immediately." "I don't think you're in a position to order anyone to do anything, Your Honor," I said. "In fact, I don't think you should be sitting on that bench at all. Agent Martinez has been investigating judicial corruption in this district for 8 months, and your partnership with my husband has been under federal surveillance for the last 3. The door to the courtroom opened, and a woman in a dark suit walked in with the confident stride of someone who carried a badge. Agent Martinez was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that took in the scene with professional assessment. "Judge Blackwell," she said, her voice crisp and official, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of judicial corruption, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The rest of Agent Martinez's words were lost in the chaos that erupted as bailiffs moved to restrain Judge Blackwell and federal agents flooded into the courtroom. Charles sat frozen in his chair, watching his world collapse in real time. "Charles Williams," Agent Martinez continued once Judge Blackwell had been led away in handcuffs, "you're also under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." As they read Charles his rights and fitted him with handcuffs, he looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before: fear. Real, genuine fear of a woman he'd underestimated for 30 years. "Margaret," he said, as they led him toward the door. "Why? We built this together. We were partners." "No, Charles," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos around us. "I built this. You just took credit for it, and partners don't steal from each other." As the courtroom cleared, leaving me alone with Robert Chen and the wreckage of what had once been my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete control over my own destiny. The war was far from over. Charles and his lawyers would fight the charges, try to plea bargain, attempt to minimize his culpability by blaming everything on Judge Blackwell. But for the first time in 30 years, I held all the cards. Williams Industries belonged to me now, not because a judge had awarded it to me in a divorce settlement, but because I was the one who'd actually built it, and I was finally ready to prove that fact to the world. The media circus that followed the arrests was exactly what I'd expected, and nothing I could have prepared for. By the next morning, news vans lined the street outside our house, and my face was on the front page of every newspaper in Ohio under headlines like "Housewife Brings Down Corrupt Empire" and "The Quiet Woman Who Knew Too Much." I'd hired a public relations firm the day after Charles's arrest, a smart, aggressive company that specialized in managing complex legal stories. Their advice was simple: control the narrative before the narrative controls you. "Mrs. Williams," said Patricia Reeves, the lead publicist assigned to my case, "the story that's emerging is that you were an innocent wife who accidentally discovered your husband's crimes. That's good for sympathy, but it's not good for establishing your credibility as a business leader." She was right, of course. If I wanted to maintain control of Williams Industries, I needed people to see me as the brilliant strategist who'd built the company, not the naive victim who'd stumbled onto corruption by accident. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We tell the truth," Patricia said. "The whole truth. You weren't just documenting crimes, you were building a business empire. You weren't just collecting evidence, you were creating one of the most successful manufacturing companies in the Midwest. The corruption investigation is secondary to the real story. Margaret Williams is a business genius who's been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. The first interview was with Business Weekly, a respected magazine that had actually profiled Charles just 2 years earlier. The irony was delicious. They'd written a glowing article about his innovative leadership, and now they were back to learn the truth about who'd really been running Williams Industries. "Mrs. Williams," said the reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Harrison, "can you walk us through how you actually built Williams Industries while your husband was taking credit for your work?" I'd practiced this answer for weeks, working with Patricia to strike the right balance between confidence and humility. "The truth is, Jennifer, I never set out to be invisible, but in the early years, it was easier to let Charles be the public face while I focused on the actual work of building the company. By the time I realized how much credit he was taking, we were so successful that changing the dynamic seemed less important than continuing to grow." "But you were documenting everything." "I'm a businesswoman," I said simply. "Documentation is what we do. I kept records of every decision, every strategy session, every innovation, not because I suspected Charles of anything, but because that's how you run a complex operation. The fact that those records later proved useful in exposing corruption was fortunate timing." The article that appeared 3 weeks later was everything Patricia had hoped for. The headline read, "The Hidden Genius of Williams Industries," and the subhead noted that Margaret Williams may be the most underestimated business leader in America. More importantly, the article included detailed analysis of my actual contributions to the company's success. They interviewed former employees who confirmed that I'd been the one making key decisions. They spoke with clients who revealed they'd been working with me directly for years, thinking I was Charles's special consultant. They even tracked down Sandra Chen, now retired from Computic, who laughed when they asked about Charles's role in securing their original contract. "Margaret Williams was the most impressive business strategist I ever worked with," Sandra told them. "She understood our needs before we did, and she delivered solutions that exceeded every expectation. Charles, he was a nice man who showed up to sign the contracts Margaret had already negotiated." The vindication felt better than I'd imagined it would. For 30 years, I'd been the woman behind the man behind the success. Now, finally, people were seeing me for who I really was. But Charles wasn't going quietly. From his lawyer's office, where he was out on bail pending trial, he was mounting his own public relations campaign. His strategy was predictable: paint me as a bitter ex-wife who was exaggerating my contributions to get revenge for his affair. Margaret was always supportive, he told a local news station, managing to look wounded and noble at the same time. But the idea that she was running Williams Industries is simply not credible. She helped with some administrative tasks, certainly, but the strategic vision, the major decisions, the leadership that built our success, that was my work. He even produced former employees willing to testify that they'd rarely seen me in the office, that Charles had been the one giving directions and making decisions. Of course, they were telling the truth. I had worked mostly from home, and Charles had been the one delivering the instructions I'd given him. But without context, their statements made it seem like Charles was the real leader, and I was just a helpful spouse. The media loved the conflict. Here was a story with everything: corporate corruption, marital betrayal, a David and Goliath battle between a quiet housewife and a powerful businessman. The fact that both sides had compelling evidence for their claims just made it more dramatic. That's when I decided to play my final card. Williams Industries had always been privately held, which meant there were no public shareholders to worry about, no board of directors to appease. The company belonged entirely to Charles and me as marital assets, which meant that until our divorce was finalized, I had as much legal right to run the business as he did. With Charles facing federal charges and prohibited from making major business decisions while on bail, I quietly stepped into the CEO role I'd been performing unofficially for 30 years. My first act was to call a company-wide meeting. Every employee, from the factory floor to the executive offices, gathered in the main warehouse on a gray Thursday morning in November. Many of them had never seen me before, despite the fact that I'd been making the decisions that shaped their working lives for decades. I know many of you are confused and concerned about the recent events, I began, standing on a makeshift platform constructed from shipping pallets. You're wondering what Charles's arrest means for the company, for your jobs, for the future of Williams Industries. The crowd was silent, waiting. These were good people who'd worked hard to build something they were proud of. They deserved to know that their efforts hadn't been in vain. I want you to know that Williams Industries is not going anywhere, I continued. This company was built by all of us, working together, creating products we can be proud of. That work continues, regardless of what happens in courtrooms or newspaper headlines. I paused, looking out at faces I recognized from years of plant visits, people who'd helped implement my innovations without knowing they were mine. I also want you to know that I've been working alongside Charles to build this company for 30 years. Many of the strategies, innovations, and decisions that made Williams Industries successful came from my work, my planning, my vision for what we could become together. The murmur that went through the crowd was skeptical but not hostile. They'd heard the media reports, but seeing me there, speaking with authority about their work, was different from reading newspaper headlines. I'm not here to ask you to choose sides or to relitigate my marriage in public, I said. I'm here to tell you that Williams Industries has a future, and that future starts with recognizing who we really are and what we've actually accomplished. Joe Kowalski, now the plant manager after 30 years with the company, raised his hand. Mrs. Williams, what exactly are you saying about the company's leadership? I'm saying that effective immediately, I'm assuming full operational control of Williams Industries. Charles is facing federal charges that prevent him from managing business operations, which means it's my responsibility to ensure this company continues to thrive. The silence that followed was profound. In a single moment, I'd gone from being the boss's wife to being the boss. And looking out at those faces, I realized that most of them were ready to accept that transition, if I could prove I was worthy of their trust. The proof would come in the months ahead, as I worked to show that Williams Industries under my leadership wasn't just surviving Charles's downfall, it was becoming stronger than ever. But first, I had to deal with the immediate challenge of running a company while my husband's criminal trial dominated every news cycle. Because Charles might have been removed from day-to-day operations, but he wasn't done fighting for control of the empire we'd built together. The real war was just beginning. Running Williams Industries without Charles was like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for 30 years. Decisions that used to require elaborate justifications and careful manipulation of Charles's ego could now be made quickly and efficiently. Strategies I'd been developing for years but couldn't implement because they threatened Charles's image of himself as the brilliant leader could finally be put into action. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Within 6 weeks of taking control, we'd secured 3 new major contracts, including one with a European technology consortium that would expand our international presence for the first time. Our production efficiency increased by 22% after I implemented process improvements I'd been designing for months, but couldn't convince Charles to try. Most importantly, the workers responded to my leadership with an enthusiasm I hadn't expected. For years, they'd been taking orders filtered through Charles, instructions that often lost important details or nuance in translation. Now they were getting direction from the source, and they could see the difference immediately. "Mrs. Williams," said Maria Santos, our quality control supervisor, during a weekly department meeting, "the new testing protocols are working better than anything we've tried before. Defect rates are down 40%, and the line workers say they understand exactly what standards they're supposed to meet." "That's because I designed those protocols based on actual floor experience," I replied. Charles never spent enough time in production to understand what quality control really meant in practice. It was a small comment, but it represented a larger truth that was becoming obvious to everyone. I knew this business in ways Charles never had. He'd been the charming figurehead while I'd been the engine that made everything work. The media was starting to notice too. Business publications that had once treated Williams Industries as Charles's personal success story were now running features about my leadership transition. The headlines had shifted from focusing on the scandal to recognizing the substance. "Margaret Williams shows what quiet leadership looks like," and "the woman who built an empire from the shadows." But Charles wasn't accepting his diminished role gracefully. Despite being prohibited from major business decisions while facing federal charges, he was working through intermediaries to undermine my authority. His lawyer, an expensive Philadelphia firm that specialized in white-collar defense, was arguing that my control of the company violated the terms of his bail agreement. "Your Honor," said James Morrison, Charles's lead attorney during a hearing I'd been forced to attend, "Mr. Williams is prohibited from making business decisions that could affect the assets under investigation." But Williams Industries was his life's work. Allowing his estranged wife to potentially damage the company's value while his criminal case is pending violates his due process rights. Judge Patricia Coleman, who'd been assigned to our divorce case after Judge Blackwell's arrest, was not impressed with this argument. "Mr. Morrison, your client is facing federal charges related to how he built this business. The court's concern is preventing further criminal activity, not protecting his business interests." "But Mrs. Williams has no experience running a major corporation," Morrison continued. "She's making changes that could irreparably harm the company's value and reputation." That's when I stood up, something I probably shouldn't have done but couldn't resist. "Your Honor, if I may respond to Mr. Morrison's concerns about my qualifications?" Judge Coleman looked amused. "This is highly irregular, Mrs. Williams, but given the unusual circumstances, I'll allow it." "Mr. Morrison," I said, turning to face Charles's lawyer directly, "you say I have no experience running a major corporation. Can you explain how someone with no management experience could increase production efficiency by 22% in 6 weeks?" Morrison started to respond, but I wasn't finished. "Can you explain how someone with no business qualifications could secure 3 major new contracts while her supposedly qualified husband was running the company into federal investigation?" "Mrs. Williams," Morrison tried again, "can you explain how someone with no leadership experience could earn the unanimous support of our workforce while implementing the most significant operational changes in the company's history?" Judge Coleman was trying not to smile. "Mrs. Williams, I think you've made your point." "Actually, Your Honor, I have one more point to make," I said, pulling a document from my briefcase. "This is a letter signed by every department head at Williams Industries, formally requesting that I continue as CEO regardless of the outcome of divorce proceedings. They cite improved communication, more efficient decision-making, and better working conditions under my leadership." I handed the letter to the court clerk, then turned back to Morrison. "So when you say I'm not qualified to run this company, I have to ask, qualified according to whom?" The hearing ended with Judge Coleman ruling that I could continue operating Williams Industries as long as I provided quarterly reports on major decisions and maintained the company's value. It was a complete victory, but I knew Charles would find other ways to challenge my authority. He tried sabotage first. 3 weeks after the hearing, I discovered that Charles had been contacting our major clients, suggesting that Williams Industries was unstable under my leadership and recommending they consider alternative suppliers. It was a desperate move that backfired spectacularly when two of our biggest clients called to complain about his interference. "Margaret," said Tom Bradley, the procurement director at one of our largest accounts, "I don't know what Charles thinks he's accomplishing, but he called here yesterday trying to undermine your authority. I told him that Williams Industries has never performed better than it has under your leadership, and if he contacts us again, we'll consider it harassment." The attempted sabotage actually strengthened my position by demonstrating that our clients preferred working with me directly rather than through Charles. It also gave me grounds to request a restraining order, preventing him from contacting Williams Industries employees or clients while his criminal case was pending. But Charles's most effective attack came through the media. He gave an interview to a business podcast called Empire Builders, where he presented himself as the wronged husband whose life's work was being destroyed by a vindictive ex-wife. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice heavy with carefully crafted regret. "I trusted people I shouldn't have trusted, and I allowed my personal relationships to compromise my business judgment. But Williams Industries was my vision, my creation. Watching Margaret tear down everything I built is more painful than any legal consequences I might face." The interviewer, a young man who clearly found Charles's narrative compelling, asked softball questions that allowed him to position himself as the tragic hero of this story. Charles spoke movingly about the company's humble origins, the workers whose livelihoods depended on Williams Industries, and his fears that my inexperience and emotional decision-making would destroy decades of careful growth. It was a masterful performance that generated significant sympathy for Charles and raised new questions about my qualifications. The business media, always eager for a dramatic narrative, began running stories about whether emotional divorce conflicts should influence corporate leadership decisions. That's when I realized I needed to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. Charles wanted to fight this battle in public? Fine. But he was about to learn that when it comes to media manipulation, the woman who actually built the empire had advantages he'd never considered. Because I had something Charles didn't. The truth, and 26 years of evidence to prove it. And I was finally ready to use both weapons to their maximum effect. The real media war was about to begin, and Charles Williams was going to discover that underestimating Margaret Williams had been the last mistake of his rapidly collapsing career. Charles's media offensive had been smart and effective, but it suffered from one crucial flaw. It was based on lies, and lies have a way of unraveling when someone else holds the truth. I'd spent 6 weeks letting him control the narrative, while I quietly gathered ammunition for a counterattack that would settle this battle once and for all. My opportunity came when 60 Minutes approached me for an interview. The producer, a tough investigative journalist named Rebecca Martinez, wanted to do a comprehensive piece about corporate corruption and how wives of powerful men navigate scandal. She'd already filmed segments with other women whose husbands had been convicted of white-collar crimes, and she was looking for someone who represented a different perspective on the story. "Mrs. Williams," Rebecca said during our preliminary phone conversation, "most of the women we've interviewed were genuinely surprised by their husbands' criminal activities. Your case is unique because you've claimed extensive knowledge of both the legitimate business operations and the illegal activities. We'd like to explore that complexity." It was exactly the platform I needed. 60 Minutes had the credibility to present complex evidence in a way that would reach millions of viewers, and Rebecca Martinez had the reputation for thorough investigation that would make my claims credible. "I'll participate," I told her. "But I want complete editorial control over how my business documentation is presented. I'm not interested in being portrayed as either a victim or a villain. I want people to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions." The filming took place over 3 days at Williams Industries, with cameras documenting both my management of daily operations and my presentation of the evidence I'd collected over 30 years. Rebecca's team spent hours reviewing the materials I'd kept in my safety deposit box, and their fact-checkers worked around the clock to verify the most explosive claims. The segment that aired 6 weeks later was devastating to Charles's carefully crafted narrative. It opened with footage of me walking through the Williams Industries factory floor, greeting workers by name and discussing technical details of our production processes with an expertise that was obviously genuine. The narrator, veteran correspondent Steve Morrison, introduced the story by noting that while Charles Williams faced federal charges, his ex-wife had transformed their company into its most profitable period in company history. Margaret Williams, Morrison said in his distinctive voice, claims that she was not just aware of her husband's business operations, but that she was actually the architect of Williams Industries' success. Tonight, for the first time, she presents evidence to support that claim. What followed was the most thorough vindication I could have imagined. The cameras showed selected documents from my collection, with expert analysis confirming their authenticity. They interviewed former employees who testified that I'd been making key decisions for years. They spoke with clients who confirmed they'd been working with me directly, often thinking I was Charles's mysterious, strategic consultant. But the most powerful moment came when Rebecca asked me about Charles's recent media appearances, where he'd claimed I was destroying his life's work. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "your husband has suggested that you're motivated by revenge rather than business acumen. How do you respond to that?" I looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of people who would eventually see this interview. "Rebecca, revenge would be destroying what we built together. What I'm doing is finally getting credit for building it in the first place. If Charles is hurt by people learning the truth about Williams Industries, perhaps he should have considered that before spending 30 years taking credit for my work." The segment included a brief response from Charles, filmed at his lawyer's office, where he continued to insist that I was exaggerating my contributions. But placed immediately after 20 minutes of documented evidence, his denials sounded hollow and desperate. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the broadcast, Williams Industries received dozens of calls from potential clients who wanted to work with the real genius behind the company. Business publications ran follow-up stories exploring how many other successful businesses might be led by women whose contributions had been minimized or erased entirely. More importantly for my immediate situation, Charles's credibility was completely destroyed. His lawyer's attempts to challenge my control of the company suddenly seemed ridiculous in light of documented proof that I'd been running Williams Industries for decades. But Charles wasn't finished fighting. If media manipulation couldn't restore his position, he was prepared to try more direct methods. The attack came on a Thursday evening in February, 6 months after his arrest. I was working late in my office, reviewing contracts for a potential expansion into renewable energy components, when I heard the security alarm activate in the main building. Williams Industries had excellent security systems, motion detectors and cameras that monitored every entrance after hours. The alarm meant someone was in the building who shouldn't be there, and given the timing, I had a pretty good idea who that someone might be. I called the security company first, then the police, then locked my office door and waited. Through my window, I could see a figure moving through the factory floor with a flashlight, someone who clearly knew the layout well enough to navigate in the dark. Charles had come for something specific, and I was fairly certain I knew what it was. 3 months earlier, during discovery proceedings for his criminal case, Charles's lawyers had requested access to Williams Industries' financial records. I'd provided everything legally required, but there was one set of documents they hadn't asked for, and I hadn't volunteered: the detailed business plans I'd been developing for the company's future growth. Those plans, stored in the safe in my office, represented 5 years of research and strategic thinking about opportunities in emerging markets. They were worth millions of dollars in competitive advantage, and they were also proof that I'd been planning for Williams Industries' future long before Charles's arrest had forced me into public leadership. If Charles could steal those plans, he could either use them to start a competing business or sell them to our rivals. Either way, he'd be able to claim that any future success I achieved was based on strategies he'd developed before his legal troubles began. The police arrived within 10 minutes, surrounding the building and flooding the interior with searchlights. They found Charles in my office, crouched over the safe with a drill and a bag of electronic equipment. He'd managed to partially open the safe, but he hadn't yet accessed the documents inside. "Mrs. Williams," said Detective Karen Walsh, "do you want to press charges for breaking and entering?" I looked at Charles, handcuffed and surrounded by police officers, drilling equipment scattered around my violated office. He met my eyes with a mixture of desperation and rage that reminded me exactly why I'd spent so many years documenting his corruption. "Absolutely," I said, And I want to add attempted theft of trade secrets to the charges. As they led Charles away for the second time in 6 months, he turned back to shout at me, "You can't keep stealing everything I built, Margaret. This company is mine. Everything you have is mine." The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. Charles Williams, caught red-handed trying to steal documents from the company I'd actually built, was accusing me of theft. Detective Walsh shook her head as she watched the police car disappear down the road. "Mrs. Williams, I have to ask, what was in that safe that was worth risking a federal case for?" I walked over to the damaged safe and pulled out the thick folder of strategic plans Charles had been trying to steal. "Detective Walsh, this contains my plans for the future of Williams Industries. 5 years of research into renewable energy markets, international expansion opportunities, and technological innovations that could transform our industry." "And your husband wanted to steal these plans?" "Charles wanted to steal these plans," I corrected gently, "because they represent the same thing he's been stealing for 30 years. My ideas, my work, my vision for what this company could become." I looked around the office Charles had violated, at the damaged safe and scattered equipment that represented his final desperate attempt to reclaim control over what he'd never actually built. The difference is that this time, everyone can see exactly what he's really doing. Charles's arrest for breaking and entering made national news within hours, complete with security camera footage of him drilling into my safe. The images were damning. A man who claimed to be the rightful owner of Williams Industries, caught on camera trying to steal documents from the woman who was successfully running the company he could no longer control. The attempted theft marked the end of Charles's campaign to reclaim his reputation. His lawyers could no longer argue that he was the wronged party in this situation, not when he was facing additional felony charges for trying to steal from the very company he claimed to own. But more importantly, Charles's break-in attempt had given me something I'd never had before: absolute moral clarity in the eyes of the public. I was no longer the estranged wife with questionable motives. I was the legitimate business leader defending her company from a desperate criminal who would stop at nothing to reclaim control over assets that had never belonged to him. The war was over. I'd won not just the battle for Williams Industries, but the larger fight for recognition of who I really was and what I'd actually accomplished. Now all that remained was ensuring that Charles Williams faced the full consequences of 30 years of theft, corruption, and lies. Charles's trial began on a crisp October morning. Exactly 1 year after Judge Blackwell's arrest had triggered the investigation that brought down their entire corrupt enterprise. The federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland was packed with media, business leaders, and Williams Industries employees who'd taken time off to watch justice finally catch up with the man who'd stolen credit for their work. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, where I'd have a clear view of Charles throughout the proceedings. He looked older than his 58 years, worn down by months of legal pressure and public humiliation. The confident businessman who dismissed me as a dried-up hag had been replaced by a desperate man facing the possibility of spending the rest of his productive life in federal prison. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Lead prosecutor Amanda Chen, a sharp young attorney who specialized in white-collar crime, had spent months organizing my evidence into a comprehensive narrative that left no room for doubt about Charles's guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said in her opening statement, "this case is about a man who built his success on a foundation of lies, corruption, and theft. Not theft of money, though there was plenty of that, but theft of something even more valuable: recognition for the brilliant work of the woman who actually built Williams Industries." The evidence I'd collected over 30 years was presented with devastating precision. Recorded phone conversations where Charles and Judge Blackwell discussed manipulating court decisions for financial gain. Email exchanges detailing their scheme to use insider information for real estate investments. Financial documents proving that Williams Industries' major contracts had been secured through corruption rather than legitimate competition. But the most powerful testimony came from the people who'd worked with me directly over the years, who could describe in detail how I'd actually been running Williams Industries while Charles took credit publicly. Sandra Chen, now 72 and retired from Computech Industries, was particularly effective. I worked with Margaret Williams for 15 years, she told the jury. She was the most brilliant strategic thinker I ever encountered in 4 decades of business. Charles Williams? He was a nice man who showed up to sign contracts that Margaret had already negotiated. Joe Kowalski, now plant manager, testified about how my innovations had transformed Williams Industries' production capabilities. Mrs. Williams understood our equipment better than our own engineers, he said. She could walk onto the factory floor and spot efficiency problems that had been slowing us down for months. Mr. Williams rarely set foot in the plant, and when he did, he had no idea what he was looking at. The defense tried desperately to minimize my role and maximize Charles's legitimate contributions to the business. His new lawyer, an expensive New York attorney named David Richardson, argued that while Charles might have made some ethical lapses, he genuinely built Williams Industries through his own efforts. Margaret Williams was a supportive spouse, Richardson told the jury, and she certainly contributed to her husband's success. But the idea that she was the secret mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar corporation while pretending to be a simple housewife strains credibility beyond the breaking point. It was a reasonable argument that might have worked if the prosecution hadn't had overwhelming evidence to the contrary. When Amanda Chen presented recordings of me personally negotiating major contracts while Charles was out of town, Richardson's narrative collapsed completely. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Charles took the stand in his own defense. It was a risky strategy that his lawyers had clearly advised against, but Charles's ego wouldn't allow him to stay silent while his life's work was attributed to someone else. I built Williams Industries, he insisted under direct examination from Richardson. Margaret helped, certainly, but the vision, the leadership, the strategic decisions that made us successful, those came from me. Amanda Chen's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She had Charles walk through specific business decisions, asking him to explain the reasoning behind strategies that I'd actually developed. When he couldn't provide coherent explanations, she presented documentation proving that I'd been the one making those decisions. "Mr. Williams," she said, holding up a contract from 2018, "can you explain the strategic thinking behind your decision to enter the renewable energy components market?" "Well," Charles said, clearly struggling, "we saw opportunities in emerging technologies, and we adapted our production capabilities to serve those markets. But this email, sent from your account to the client, contains technical specifications and market analysis that your own expert witness testified you couldn't have written. Can you explain that?" "I relied on consultants." "Your wife, you mean. The consultant was your wife, Margaret Williams, who developed this entire strategy while you were playing golf at your country club." Richardson objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. Charles's testimony had revealed him as a man who'd taken credit for work he couldn't even understand, let alone have created himself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and judicial corruption. Charles's face went white as the foreman read each verdict, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the delusion he'd maintained for months. Judge Maria Santos, who'd been brought in from another district to ensure impartiality, sentenced Charles to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. "Mr. Williams," she said, "you violated the public trust, corrupted judicial proceedings, and stole recognition from the woman who actually built the success you claimed as your own. Your crimes represent a betrayal not just of your business partners and your wife, but of every honest entrepreneur who builds success through legitimate means." As the bailiffs led Charles away in handcuffs, he looked at me one final time. The anger and desperation were gone, replaced by something that might have been understanding. For the first time in 30 years, Charles Williams had to confront the reality of who he actually was versus who he'd pretended to be. "Margaret," he said, just loud enough for me to hear, "I'm sorry." I nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond. After 3 decades of lies, Charles's apology was too little and far too late. But it was something, a recognition that justice had finally caught up with him. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and photographers, I made a brief statement that I'd been preparing for months. "Justice was served today," I said. "Not just for me, but for every woman whose contributions have been minimized, ignored, or stolen by men who took credit for work they didn't do. Williams Industries will continue to thrive under my leadership and will continue to innovate and grow in ways that honor the truth about how success is really achieved. A reporter shouted a question about whether I felt vindicated by Charles's conviction. "I don't feel vindicated," I replied. "I feel free. Free to run my company without having to pretend someone else deserves credit for my work. Free to be recognized for what I've actually accomplished, and free to build an even brighter future for Williams Industries and everyone who depends on it." As I walked away from the courthouse, past the cameras and reporters and curiosity seekers, I realized that this moment wasn't just the end of Charles's story. It was the beginning of mine. For 30 years, I'd been Margaret Williams, the woman behind the man behind the success. Now, finally, I was just Margaret Williams, CEO of Williams Industries. The company I'd built from nothing through intelligence, hard work, and the patience to wait for justice to catch up with the truth. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after Charles's sentencing, I stood in the boardroom of the newly renovated Williams Industries headquarters, looking out at a view that had been impossible to imagine when this whole journey began. The building itself was transformed, modern and efficient, with sustainable design elements that reflected our expanding role in the renewable energy sector. But the real transformation wasn't in the building. It was in the company culture, the business relationships, and most importantly, in my own recognition of what I'd actually accomplished over 3 decades of building an empire that someone else had claimed as his own. "Mrs. Williams," said Jennifer Park, our new VP of Strategic Development, "the merger proposal from Techstar Industries is ready for your final review." The Techstar merger represented everything Charles had never understood about building sustainable business success. Instead of acquiring companies through corruption and insider information, we were partnering with organizations that shared our values and complemented our capabilities. Techstar brought cutting-edge research and development resources. Williams Industries provided manufacturing expertise and established client relationships. Together, we'd create one of the largest renewable energy component manufacturers in North America, with the potential to transform how clean technology was produced and distributed globally. It was the kind of visionary expansion I'd been planning for years but could never implement while Charles was focused on short-term profits and personal recognition. "The financial projections look solid," I said, reviewing the documents Jennifer had prepared, "and their corporate culture aligns with our commitment to transparency and ethical business practices." That commitment wasn't just philosophical posturing. After Charles's conviction, I'd implemented the most comprehensive corporate governance policies in our industry. Every major decision was documented and reviewed by independent advisors. All client relationships were managed through formal protocols that prevented the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed everything we'd built. Most importantly, I'd established profit-sharing programs that ensured every Williams Industries employee benefited directly from the company's success. The people who actually created our products and served our clients deserved to share in the wealth their work generated. "There's one more thing," Jennifer said, pulling out a tablet with the latest business news. "Forbes is running a cover story about you next week. The headline is, 'The CEO Who Built an Empire in Secret.' The article, which I'd spent hours reviewing for accuracy, was the most comprehensive profile of my actual role in building Williams Industries. Forbes had conducted extensive interviews with clients, employees, and industry experts, all of whom confirmed that I'd been the strategic force behind the company's success for decades. But more than vindication, the article represented something larger: recognition that my story wasn't unique. The business world was full of brilliant women whose contributions had been minimized, whose achievements had been credited to male colleagues or supervisors, whose strategic thinking had been dismissed as support work rather than leadership. Margaret Williams, the article concluded, represents thousands of women who've been building American business success from behind the scenes, waiting for their moment to step into the recognition they've always deserved. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer, Robert Chen, who'd become a close friend during the long battle to reclaim my company. "Margaret, just saw the advance copy of the Forbes article. Congratulations, you've officially gone from dried-up hag to business genius in less than 2 years. Not bad for a woman with no experience running a major corporation. I laughed, remembering Charles's lawyer's arguments about my supposed lack of qualifications. These days, Williams Industries was being used as a case study in business schools across the country, not as an example of how to build a company through corruption, but as a model of how strategic thinking and ethical leadership could create sustainable success. The irony was delicious. Charles had spent 30 years taking credit for my work, and now that work was being studied and celebrated while he served his federal prison sentence. Justice had a sense of humor after all. My assistant knocked on the boardroom door. "Mrs. Williams, your 3 o'clock appointment is here." The appointment was with Sarah Mitchell, a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a comprehensive film about women in business whose achievements had been stolen or minimized by male colleagues. Sarah had already interviewed dozens of women across various industries, and she believed my story could serve as the centerpiece for a documentary that might change how people thought about recognition and credit in professional settings. "Mrs. Williams," Sarah said as she set up her camera equipment, "I want to start with a simple question. When you spoke those 5 words in the courtroom, 'I am Williams Industries, Charles,' did you know how completely your life was about to change?" I considered the question carefully. When I'd stood up in that courtroom 18 months ago, I'd been focused on stopping Charles from stealing my company through corrupt judicial proceedings. I hadn't been thinking about media attention or public recognition or becoming a symbol for undervalued women in business. "I knew my life was going to change," I said finally, "but I had no idea how much I was going to enjoy the change. For 30 years, I'd been hiding my intelligence, minimizing my contributions, pretending someone else deserved credit for my work. Standing up in that courtroom wasn't just about saving my company. It was about finally being honest about who I really was." "And who are you, really?" "I'm Margaret Williams," I said, looking directly into the camera, "CEO and founder of Williams Industries. I'm the woman who spent 3 decades building a multi-million-dollar company while pretending my husband was the genius behind our success. I'm proof that the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman is underestimate her capacity for patience, planning, and perfect timing when it comes to getting justice." Sarah smiled. "That's going to be a great ending for the documentary." But it wasn't an ending, I realized, as Sarah packed up her equipment and left me alone in the boardroom, with the late afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a beginning. I walked over to the wall where I'd hung a photo from our company's early days, back when Williams Manufacturing employed 15 people and operated out of a single building in Ohio. In the photo, Charles stood in the center, grinning and pointing to our first major contract. I was barely visible in the background, standing next to the machinery I'd helped redesign to meet our client's specifications. For 30 years, that photo had represented everything wrong with how the world saw Williams Industries. Today, it represented something entirely different, evidence of how far we'd come, how much we'd grown, and how completely the truth had finally emerged. Tomorrow morning, I'd wake up in the house I'd bought with money from the company I'd built, surrounded by recognition for achievements that were finally credited to their actual creator. I'd drive to the office of Williams Industries, where 400 employees depended on the strategic thinking and ethical leadership I'd been developing for 3 decades. And I'd continue building the empire I'd always been building. Except now everyone would know exactly who was responsible for its success. Charles Williams had called me a dried-up hag who'd contributed nothing to our success. History would remember me as Margaret Williams, the brilliant businesswoman who built an empire while her husband took credit, then reclaimed it all when justice finally caught up with the truth. Not bad for a woman who'd supposedly never worked a day in her life. The sun was setting over Cleveland, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of new beginnings and endless possibilities. I gathered my things, turned off the lights, and headed home to plan tomorrow's strategies for the company that had always been mine. Williams Industries was thriving under my leadership. Charles was serving his well-deserved prison sentence, and I was finally getting recognition for 30 years of brilliant work. Justice, it turned out, was even sweeter than revenge, and I was just getting started. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.